In this game, we're going to look at how to use strategical goals, the X-ray attack, the gang attack, and power moves to plan what moves we're going to make based on the moves our opponent gives us. Let's evaluate the position for a moment. Let's first count how many pawns are on the board. We see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 white pawns, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 black pawns. So we're even there. And we have 2 rooks, 2 black rooks and 2 white rooks, and we have a bishop against a knight. Bishops are faster than knights, so they're usually better if they have room to maneuver in. But when there are a lot of pawns on the board, it's difficult for bishops sometimes to run around, and the knight, since it can hop, often has more mobility than the bishops. But in this game we see that all of these pawns can be moved, and so it's difficult to determine really which piece is better here. Probably because the pawns are able to be moved around, they're not locked into position. The bishop will probably be able to find a lot of maneuvering room soon. Now let's compare the mobility of the rooks on the board. We see that the black rooks are hitting their own pawns here. They really they're not in a very attacking posture. And if we look at the white rooks, we see that there's an open file here. There are no pawns in front of the white rook here, and so the white rooks have more mobility and are a little bit better than the black rooks right now, or maybe a lot better. Part of your evaluation should always consist of what is already being attacked. So in this position we see that the white rook is attacking this pawn. The bishop is attacking this pawn, but it's defended by a pawn and also a rook. So using the strategical goals that you read about in the book and other strategical tips, I'd like you to find a good move for white. So pause the video. Okay, we learned in the book that kings and queens make poor defenders since they're so easily harassed. And we also learned that rooks are better when they're united and when they've formed a battery. So you should have found rook to f1, uniting the 2 rooks. And now we have, using a gang attack, we've got 2 attackers against 1 defender. This puts white on the attack and gives him the initiative. Black decides to protect this pawn by moving the target. So he moves the pawn forward. And now, using power moves as your guide, I would like you to find another good move for white. So pause the video. Okay, you should have found preparation for check. We see that the white diagonal now has been opened. And whenever your opponent moves, you have to see what has he given me. And we see indeed that white prepares to check the king in 2 moves. 1, 2. The old 1, 2 in action again. Black responds by pushing the pawn here, and we're going to evaluate that in a moment. And white launches the check, and the king sidesteps the check, gets out of check. And now black has a decision to make. White has a decision to make here. Should we could allow the capture, and then the queen could recapture. We could capture ourselves, which would allow the rook to recapture, or we could move the target. If we consider mobility as a main factor in our decision-making process, we see that if we allow the capture, or if we capture, this activates the rook. This gives the rook a lot of mobility and the attack on this open file. So with that in mind, white decided to move the pawn forward and keep the rook out of the game. Okay, so the black rook moves to this file. At least it's now in a little more active position here. And now I would like you to find a preparation for check in 2 moves. So this would be a 1, 2, 3 with the final execution of check. So I'd like you to find move towards check. So look for a preparation for check in 2 moves. So pause the video. Did you find it? When the rook moves back to f3 here, it's preparing to check the king by sliding here. So this would be a 1, 2, 3. But this is 1, 2. 1, 2. Black tries to get a little closer into enemy territory, so slides the knight over, and the rook continues with its plan to prepare to check the king, and slides over. There are several ways that black can deal with this attack on the pawn, but he chooses to defend it by moving the king, and now there's a discovered defense by the queen on this pawn. Since white has a little bit more mobility here, it's difficult for black to come up with a move that doesn't increase white's mobility even further. When there are so many pawns on the board, who's ever able to activate their pieces first will usually be able to come up with a nice winning attack, or at least some sort of attack. So on the next move, white plays increases the mobility of his bishop a little bit by moving here. It also possibly allows him to come in here. I'm not sure what white's plan is right here, but it increases the mobility of the bishop a little bit, and it's threatening to bring the bishop in. So the queen slides over to prevent this, at least that. And now I would like you to find an undefended piece in the black camp and launch an X-ray attack on this undefended piece. So pause the video. Okay, did you find this undefended pawn here? And now the bishop can go on an X-ray attack of that pawn. It's on a white square, and we have a white squared bishop. So the bishop X-rays this undefended pawn. As you can see, the rooks are not united, and although it isn't a problem right now, it can be. And so black slides the king up, and the rooks become united. He's also maybe preparing to defend this pawn. And now white activates the attack on the undefended pawn here, and black chooses to block that attack. And now the pawns are engaged, and white has a decision to make. Should I capture this pawn, or should I allow black to capture my pawn? If you remember before, we don't really want to activate this black rook, and if we allow this capture here, if the pawn captures the white pawn, we'd have to recapture, and now we've actually created a passed pawn for black. So that pretty much rules out that option. And remember that we're always trying to increase the mobility of our pieces, and rooks always function best on an open file. And now we can see here that almost whatever exchange takes place, an open file is going to be created. So white prepares this eventuality and slides the rook over in preparation for this file to be opened. And now if black chooses to capture the pawn, the rook can recapture, and then there will be a double attack on this pawn with the bishop and the rook. And if black doesn't recapture, if black doesn't capture, we can capture, and the file is still opened. And that's what happens here. Black pushes this pawn to move the target from this rook and stop the queen from being a defender, so it can become a little more active. And then white captures the pawn, and black recaptures. And now the rook is very powerful here, very, very active. And now I would like you to evaluate the board for what is already being attacked, and I'd like you to initiate a gang attack. So pause the video. Okay, we see that this pawn is being attacked once by our bishop. So we can very simply attack it a second time by sliding the rook up, which is what white does here. And the black queen slides up to defend this pawn, so now it's two defenders against two attackers. And now I would like you to find a way to continue the attack on this pawn. I don't want to give you too many hints. So pause the video. Okay, we learned that when a piece is under attack, there are various ways of dealing with that. And one of the ways is to try to block the attacker. And in this situation, we see that we can simultaneously attack the queen and remove the defense of the queen on this pawn. So it's a way of removing the defender indirectly. So white attacks the queen, and now this pawn is no longer being defended twice, but only once by the knight. Okay, the queen has to run, of course, and she slides here. And white now is free to capture the pawn, which he does. And the knight chooses to slide in a little closer to enemy territory. Now he's got the support of this pawn here, and he can slide in here. Taking the bishop would be disastrous, of course. If the knight captures the bishop, the rook could recapture, would be checking the king, and we see that the king is pinned to the queen, so white would win the queen. So this is one of the reasons the knight slid down here. The knight is also free to regroup and slide here, blocking this file. But white has won a pawn here, and you can see how using the fundamental elements of the game, the strategical goals, gang attacks and X-ray attacks, allowed white to come up with plans that eventually won a pawn. He was able to do this because he had more mobility and the initiative, and you can use these same ideas to come up with plans of attacking in your games.